Welcome, I'm Frederick Philip von Weiss, and thank you for consuming the Thunder Nerds, a conversation with the people behind the technology that love what they do and do tech good. And today we're talking to Derek Featherstone. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with us today before your talk. You're speaking today at 2 o'clock, right?
Just after lunch, yeah.
Yeah, and today is Wednesday, October 3rd, and there's been a lot of amazing speakers this whole week, and really been happy to get a chance to speak to them, and we're super happy to speak to you today.
Happy to be here. It's an awesome event. I love speaking at an event apart. It's a premier conference for sure, so I'm super honored to be on the speaking roster, and then to get some extra time with you is kind of cool too. So
yeah, I think Eric and Jeff have been doing this since 2006. If I'm not mistaken. It's been a while. So yeah, the event just keeps growing and growing, and the participation is growing along with it, and just such amazing takeaways from this event. Yeah. So let me read a little bit about what you do, Derek, for get the people a little bit aware of you. You are a Chief Experience Officer at Level Access.
Yep. You
are a teacher, a speaker, which, by the way, I watched some of your videos on LinkedIn Learning. It's
cool.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
Cool.
And you are a authority on accessibility and inclusive design.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
that is me in a nutshell. So I my career, I was a high school teacher for many years.
Oh wow, okay.
And so that's where the teaching piece of this kind of comes pretty naturally to me. I wanted to be a teacher since I was about 12 years old. And then I went and I taught high school biology, chemistry, computers. And then I ultimately left that world, but put my teaching skills to use right away, teaching people about web design and accessibility as part of that as well. So that's kind of where all the speaking background comes from.
Yeah.
And I got into accessibility pretty early in my. So once I left teaching, I started as a developer. I was like, I can build some things. I was building websites for my students when I was teaching. So it made sense to, I was excited about it. It was like the new thing.
Sure.
So I got into building, writing HTML, writing CSS and JavaScript, and started building sites for people and teaching people about it. And it just kind of kept going from there. Accessibility was a pretty natural fit. And then, here we are this many years later, and this is what I spend all my time on.
It's amazing that since you had that teaching background, you had that, for lack of a better term, the bug to share your knowledge and provide some other tools for people to not only know what you know, but maybe some of the things that we all might not know. And you say now accessibility was kind of a natural path or fit. Could you dive into that a little bit? Like, how is that a natural fit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of it came from experiences that I had as a teenager and things like that. I lived with my grandparents for the summers because it was easier to work in the city. I grew up out in the country.
Oh, okay.
Outside of Ottawa. So living with my grandparents in the city made it much easier for working and that kind of thing. So my grandfather had a stroke in the mid-1980s, and so I kind of experienced a bunch of those, the challenges and barriers that he faced, with his disability after his recovery period. He recovered from the stroke, and he was, mentally he was all there. There was no long-term effects on sort of his his cognitive abilities, but he, his left leg and his left arm were never really the same again. He couldn't really use his left arm or his hand very much. He wasn't able to really bend his knee very much in his left leg, and so he walked with a cane, and so there was lots of physical barriers that I saw and experienced with him, and I helped, I helped them and him, kind of work around some of those things. And when I was teaching, I was very much into making sure that the lessons that I was teaching were useful for everybody. So I was teaching sciences, And, a lot of people have said things before like, oh, well, you either have like a scientific and mathematical mind or you don't. And I was trying to find ways to connect with students that were like, those students were always going to do well in the sciences and maths. Sure. But as a science teacher, I was like, I want everybody to have an understanding of scientific concepts and scientific method and things like that, so that they're kind of more informed as they grow up and get out into the world. And so I was trying to find ways to connect, students that were more arts focused or musically focused, or really good with sort of the English or creative writing side. How do I connect science concepts for them? And so that was a really important thing for me, getting that message. This message is important for everybody, regardless of their learning styles or their predispositions or their preferences or whatever it was. And so when I started building sites, it kind of seemed really natural that this stuff is for everyone, right? The web, I was kind of doing that at the beginning of the web sort of boom. And it was like this great platform that brought information to everybody. And I just wanted to make sure that it was like, it actually should be everybody, not just certain people. And so I got into that, and so accessibility kind of flowed a lot from that, I think.
Yeah. Did you find that certain kind of, you talked about different kind of brain people, and we could use the old left brain, right brain kind of way to talk about it. Did you find a certain kind of person that fit that a little bit better as far as being able to consume that information and produce and publish?
No, I don't think so. I think maybe certain people like gravitated towards doing it or were interested in it, but I didn't really notice anything that was like, oh, people that were left-brained or right-brained were more capable. I think there was a lot more like the initial interest was maybe piqued by being more of a right-brained person versus a left-brained or something. But I didn't really notice anything that was like anything that impacted their ability or their capacity for actually doing and publishing and that sort of thing. So there's all kinds of interesting things, and there's a long history of things like multiple intelligence theory and different ways of knowing, ways of being able to express that you know something or demonstrate that you know something. So there's a ton that is packed into it, but ultimately for me it was like really obvious to me, like this accessibility, understanding accessibility, and that these things are for everybody regardless of whether people have a disability or not, was like really obvious to me almost right away. And so in 2005-ish, I kind of went all in on accessibility. And I'd been doing some accessibility work before then, but as of 2005, that was kind of when I said, this is the thing that I want to do.
It's interesting because in the past, we as a community really didn't understand what accessibility meant. Just it was more like, yes, of course I use headers and the proper tags, but there wasn't maybe the same level of relevance to their everyday now. Like maybe accessibility is coming to a point where you use a tool like Alexa or some other voice technology, and you say, hey, read the recipe from that website, and if it's not marked up properly, that could be another way to think about accessibility.
Yeah, that tends to be, I think of stuff like that, using the right markup and making sure that things work in those kinds of scenarios. A lot of that is more like interoperability, right? But very closely related to that is accessibility. And so and I find that my understanding of this is always being refined and changing, because I wrote a thing a little while ago. We were doing a usability test with a woman who regularly uses Dragon Naturally Speaking, which is voice recognition software. She's been using that for years to control and work with her computer. And I asked her questions sort of as a wrap-up thing, like just kind of further exploration after we had tried to complete the tasks that she was trying to complete. And I asked sort of like, so what other assistive technologies do you use? And I was thinking like maybe she used, there's other tools that people that use Dragon sometimes use, like they'll use a tool that has built-in macros so that they can do the things that they do with Dragon, but they can do them like 5 times faster.
Right. Yeah.
Right? So they might have, macros. And so I was thinking maybe she's going to say something about a piece of software that is like, a thing that does and records macros for her so that she can get through things faster. And she said, I hadn't really pieced it all together until she said, my favorite piece of assistive technology is my Amazon Echo. And I said, oh, tell me more about that. And it was, I knew that was a useful tool for people with disabilities, but she said, some days I don't have great days. And when I can use Alexa to open the door when my care worker arrives at my place, and I can, because I'm, having a particular, difficult day, and I'm not really able to get up out of bed without, tremendous effort or it really draining me, I use Alexa to turn off my lights in my place. So like, all things that I knew an Echo and Alexa integration was capable of, but it hadn't really come through in my mind that that's a form of assistive technology, even though it wasn't invented that way or really designed to be that. It's incredibly empowering, or can be incredibly empowering for people with certain disabilities. So that was kind of a moment where I'm like, it was really about kind of that interoperability side, all the things that people are doing with Alexa skills and consuming data that way. A lot of that is pure interoperability. It has this great crossover between interoperability and accessibility. When you think about the accessibility side of it, I'm a big believer in inclusive design, and ultimately, I believe that when we design with people with disabilities as like a target, as like a thing that we want to make sure that people with disabilities are included, when we do that, we end up making it more interoperable. We end up making it makes it more accessible and more inclusive, but it has all these other side benefits that go with it in terms of, we've designed with people with disabilities in mind and embraced them and empowered them within the inclusive design process. And ultimately, we get to that point where all of that has these other side benefits that we couldn't have even fathomed. And so designing with that in mind right from the beginning is really kind of that's an interesting frontier that we're kind of now embarking on, is achieving accessibility through inclusive design. We can achieve accessibility in a whole lot of different ways. Sure. We can do it by accident. We can do it by we can make a thing that's not accessible, test it, and then go back and make it accessible and retrofit it. We can make a thing that's not accessible and then say, go and build another version of it that is accessible. It's not cost effective to do that.
Yeah. Put it on a dot subdomain. Yeah.
but we can achieve the outcome of accessibility by doing that.
Right. Yeah.
I'm a big believer that doing it through inclusive design makes it much more intentional, and it makes it a much more effective, repeatable, sustainable way to do it, rather than hey, we got lucky, we made a thing and it turned out it was accessible. Awesome, fantastic. We don't know why, but it worked out okay.
Yeah, there's so many scenarios of that where what was the company where certain people with white skin could put their hand under the soap thing and soap would come out, and then other people would put their hands under and no soap would come out. Yeah. Like there's so many of those things that don't get tested, and now we're all being a little bit more cognizant to the fact that we really need to spend time in all these fronts and invest in the research and do this right the first time rather than just quickly minimal viable product.
Well, and that's, I think that's exactly it. There's a lot of different meanings for inclusive design these days, and a lot of people are talking about inclusive design. And when they talk about inclusive design, they are thinking about and referring to, in a lot of cases, like racial diversity or gender diversity or gender identity diversity, even age-related things.
Absolutely.
But there's a lot of times when we hear and see discussions about inclusive design that aren't including people with disabilities. And inclusive design has a long history within the accessibility field and with people with disabilities. And we're kind of at this point where, hey, like, don't forget us. We're being inclusive. Let's not exclude people with disabilities. And so, the lens that I put on inclusive design tends to be working specifically with people with disabilities, because that's the lens that, I acknowledge, like, there's many, many lenses to it. And where I specialize is on the people with disability side. And so that's the lens that I kind of have, that's where my expertise is.
Mm-hmm.
And I am fully aware that there's lots of other lenses for inclusion that aren't my specialty, that I'm still learning stuff about all the time. Then we get into intersectionality, where we have multiple lenses that kind of overlap. What does it mean for for a person of color that has a disability that happens to be female? Or that, like, there's so much wrapped up in there that kind of intersectionality is really an interesting, it's an interesting topic, but it's an interesting area for, like, innovation and finding new ways of doing things. So
yeah, there's so many opportunities out there that are just waiting to be discovered. Like you said, there's lenses, and there's people that are going to bring light to these lenses and say, hey, you know what? Let's look at this and let's see what we can do in this area. Yeah. Exactly. So I think we should probably go ahead and talk about your talk, which is inclusive UX techniques for everyone.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? What inclusive techniques? Inclusive UX techniques for everyone. Let's dive into maybe a breakdown of this. What inclusive UX means, and then what techniques.
Yeah. So I mean, ultimately, for me, inclusive UX is, we think about the field of user experience design, right?
Right.
Inclusive UX and inclusive design is really, for me, a practice where we're doing UX work, but we prioritize inclusion as a core value, right? And so ultimately, that's what that means for me. So what I'm going to kind of dig into in the talk is, here's techniques that you can use if you're a designer. Here's techniques that you can use if you're a developer. Here's techniques that you can use as a manager. Here's techniques that you can use as a whole team to really dig into the inclusion side of things and be more inclusive in your work. And so that's, these are techniques that will help teams be more inclusive. And it's not like, it's an hour-long talk. So it's not like I'm saying, like, here's the only techniques. These are like tasters of techniques that people can use to just make their work better and more inclusive from the beginning, particularly including people with disabilities. That's my lens. So it's not that these techniques are going to help improve the diversity and other aspects in terms of your design. It's really about, how does these techniques for inclusion, how do they help make your product more accessible to people with disabilities in the long run? So I'm kind of going to dive into all those, a bunch of different techniques, things that are, helpful for teams to think about at the beginning of the design process, during the build process, afterwards, all throughout kind of the life cycle of creating a product.
So who do you think are the main people that should really be thinking about this? Obviously, we're talking about the designers, the experience / interaction designers. We're talking about developers. What about people in the QA? Like, they should probably be very cognizant of what's going on here and what to look for.
Yeah, I mean, so ultimately, it's everybody.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I would say even product managers, product owners, even people at a company that are at a higher level, they need some kind of awareness of this as well, so that they have an understanding of what their teams need to be doing, so that they can appropriately budget for it and allow the right amount of time, so that when somebody comes in and says, hey, I was talking with a guy a few weeks ago, just like Twitter DMs, and he was saying, like, I'm really having trouble selling this. So I'm like, yeah, man, I feel that pain, because there is sort of that, that selling aspect of it that needs to be done, because not everybody sees it as the right thing to do. They see it as an extra cost. They see it as,
can we do it on phase 2?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's why, that whole talk, and I talk about this a little bit in my talk, but that's what, prioritizing inclusion as a core value means, is that, no, we can't do it as part of phase 2. If it's not in there from the beginning, our MVP that we have put out there in the world is not accessible, right? So what does viable mean?
Yeah.
Like, viable has a lot of, people think a lot of different things about what viable means, but to me, iterations and putting something out that's viable, that MVP needs to be accessible in many ways as well. So and nothing is ever perfect. That's the beauty of MVPs, is that we put them out there. They're not perfect. We continue to iterate on them and make them better. Accessibility should be part of that as well. So I'm a big fan of that concept. So ultimately, everybody has a role to play. Yes, definitely QA teams. Their role, though, is part of the whole. We think of the testing that we do. If the only thing we're ever doing is QA testing in order to validate, like, hey, did we meet the mark in terms of accessibility, then we're not including people with disabilities in that process. And so right. I'm a big fan. Like, yes, QA the heck out of things. Do as much testing as you can do from a QA accessibility perspective. But we need to validate that with people in the community that have disabilities. We can't exclude them from the process. So we want to do that validation work with them, so that people with disabilities that are part of your target market or are part of your community, as whomever you're trying to serve, if they can actually use things and it's accessible to them, that's more important than it being accessible to the QA team.
But and all of this sounds like obvious things, right? This should be an easy sell. Whom is the person that is deemed responsible to communicate this value to, say, a C-level that might not get that right away? Or like we were talking about, sometimes it's hard to sell it. Like, how do you, one, sell it to a C-level, and how does that C-level sell it to the customer?
Yeah, so I don't know that a C-level person needs to sell it to a customer.
Okay.
Right? Ultimately, there's a certain piece of this where an organization or a company can be like this, and I'm saying this being on the outside. I'm not in everybody's scenario, but yeah. I'll throw that caveat in front of saying this. But this is the way we do things, right? Everything that we produce is accessible, and it doesn't cost more. It's just built in, because this is what it means to make a high quality product. And so there's a certain piece of that. I don't know that a C-level person needs to sell that to customers. There's value in it. We hear more and more of our customers. People continue to come to us and to come to other accessibility agencies out there. People are asking for it more and more. The customers are actually starting to demand it much more from the organizations. So
it's so important to their business. Yeah.
That to me is, there's a shift that's happening there. The customers are asking for it, which means they're actually selling it to the company, and the C-level people are sort of like, wow, okay, we need to do something about this. So I think it kind of plays out a little bit differently.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think everybody has to be able to speak articulately or reasonably articulate. Funny that I'm stumbling on the word articulately.
Yeah.
But everybody needs to be able to speak reasonably articulately to the value that inclusion and accessibility brings. The other thing that many of our clients do is they have kind of corporate social responsibility initiatives. They are committed to things. Here's what we stand for as a company.
Yeah.
In many of those cases, diversity and inclusion is making its way into those corporate values. And so that's like the perfect in, right? Like it's there. You've said that you're committed to this as part of your corporate values.
Absolutely.
So it's now time to actually act on that and demonstrate that. Show us with your actions, not just with your words. And so that's usually a really great way to start selling that. Is that you get people that are already committed to that sort of thing, but they don't know what it means to the day-to-day and what the impact of that is on the day-to-day work.
Mm-hmm.
When you can point back to it and say, we're doing this because it's part of our corporate values. That goes a long way to kind of helping. So
what are some of the future things that maybe aren't on everyone's radar that we need to look out for? And obviously there might be things that are trending that people are talking about, like, oh, you know what, within the next 3 years we really need to talk about this.
Yeah, and I don't even think it's in the next 3 years. I think it's like discussions and some of this talk is already happening now.
Okay.
Augmented reality, virtual reality, the accessibility of voice interfaces we were talking about earlier. Interestingly enough, and one of the things that we have seen with accessibility and inclusion from the beginning is when you rely on a single mode of input or output, you're automatically excluding certain people.
Absolutely.
So, one of the ways that the early Amazon Echo, and Amazon has a great accessibility team, and they are totally into this. But when the Echo first came out, it was basically voice only interaction. But then they came out with the Amazon Echo Show, which has a visual representation. So now they've actually released updates so that you can actually see captions of what Alexa is saying on the Echo Show, so that somebody that wants to consume, the family has it, but one of the people in the family happens to be deaf or hard of hearing. Those captions now that are on the Echo Show,
love that,
makes it a much more inclusive device and more inclusive experience. So that's but that reliance on a single modality, that's a thing that we need to look at, because that by definition creates barriers.
Yeah.
So how does an Echo work? An Echo and Alexa, that entire ecosystem can work really well for people with disabilities. What do we do for somebody, or how do we design with somebody in mind that has, say, cerebral palsy, that has difficulty speaking, mm-hmm. or maybe somebody that just doesn't speak at all for whatever reason? What other mechanisms are there to interface with the Echo so that it could still be a really powerful tool, but for somebody that doesn't have the ability to speak either temporarily or permanently?
Yeah.
And so designing with that scenario in mind, and designing with people with disabilities and getting into that space, to me, is like, that's kind of that's the future. So anytime we come up with these new interfaces, new technologies, new innovative ideas, that's like, we're ripe for innovation. And so we typically see it in inclusive sort of UX work or user research. We see that done in two major phases. We see it at the end of the work,
right,
to evaluate whether or not we hit the mark. What we're not doing enough is things earlier on with people with disabilities to find out what their ideas are for solving some of these problems, or what they see before we've ever built a solution. What can we do earlier in the process that helps us come up with better and more innovative solutions? So, I look at that sort of thing, and that's the kind of conversation that I think will or should dominate the next X number of years. So we're talking about things with augmented reality, virtual reality, and whatever else we invent. That to me is one of the things that we need to do to kind of change the nature of the game.
That's amazing. And I think this is probably a good time to talk about your company. As we said, you're the Chief Experience Officer at Level Access.
Yes.
So if you don't mind telling us a little bit about what the company does and maybe a little bit about what you do at the company.
Yeah, so Level Access, we've been in the accessibility space for decades. Like we've been doing this for over 20 years now.
Wow.
And we have a services team, we have a software, a product team, and so ultimately what we do is we work with companies that are interested in accessibility, that are trying to figure this stuff out, that want to make the quality of their work better from an accessibility perspective. And we help them not only figure out where they are, but what they need to, where they need to get to in order to be doing things really well.
Sure.
And a big piece of that includes figuring out what their process is and how to update their process and refine their process so that they are being more inclusive from the beginning, so that accessibility is built in from the get-go, and putting the programs in place, and putting things in at a program level, so that there's like, we deal with a lot of large companies and small companies, but with a lot of large companies, there's a lot of moving parts.
Sure.
And so it's kind of like, how do we do this as an organization so that we know that we're doing this consistently, so that we know that across our 48,000 employees, we've got a system in place that automates things that can be automated, that there builds in checks and balances to make sure that the process is working, that accessibility has been taken care of all the way along, and that we can measure it and sort of say, here's where we are from an accessibility perspective. So that's the work that we do. So it's consulting, it's testing, it is helping with process, it is teaching, it's all of literally, I don't want to say everything, but all of those different aspects that you would need to run a successful program, we kind of work in all of that space.
That's great. So a company could come to you and say, hey, we need help with this project. Can you evaluate?
Yeah, and usually that happens. Like a very typical pathway for people is, we know we've got some work to do. Help us figure. We'll go off. We'll do some testing, and we'll work with those teams. We'll say, here's the things we're finding. We'll work with them. We'll then teach their teams to, over sort of a short-term, but also a long-term thing, help you figure out what you need to know, how to change your process, and then work. Like a lot of companies have like multiple products or multiple things that they have. So we usually start with one, take those lessons, apply them everywhere else, and then get, kind of help people get on their way.
Teach them how to fish. Yeah.
Yeah. And as a former teacher, and I'm not even a former teacher, I'm still a teacher, but, I'm a big fan of that. You give a person a fish and you feed them for a day, teach them to fish, you feed them for a lifetime. Right. There's also a certain amount of fish. If I don't give you any fish while you're learning to fish, you're going to starve. So there's a balance there between, I'm going to teach you to fish, but along the way, while you can't catch your own, I'm going to give you some so that you're not starving. And we kind of move down that pathway. So there's like very tactical things, but also very strategic things that we do with our clients. And people come to us, people come to us for that kind of work all the time. So
I'd imagine so. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm the Chief Experience Officer, and that to me, it means like, I'm like C-level executive, which allows me to kind of, influence things and have set a very, a very specific direction. And one of the things that is a goal for me and why I wanted to be the Chief Experience Officer is I wanted that to kind of signal to everybody that accessibility isn't this checklist thing that we do at the end of the process. I wanted to signify to everybody as much as I could that this is part of user experience, right? We can build things that are technically sound, But if we don't have a good design, and we've done, created perfect technical execution on a design that's fundamentally inaccessible, we've kind of missed the mark.
Yeah.
Right? So, a big piece of it for me is helping people understand that this is part of user experience. It's not excuse me. It's not a thing that is just for developers. Designers have a role. Content creators and strategists have a role. Product teams have a role. Developers have a role. Testers have a role. Everybody has a role. It's not just the domain of the developer.
That's awesome. Excellent. Well, I think we're just about at the end here. I wanted to ask you if you have any kind of final word for our excuse me, for our audience that couldn't make it down to the conference. Any advice or anything you want to provide as benevolent last words?
Well, I think the thing that I would encourage you to do, and I'll encourage everybody to do this, but pick one thing. Like, we're never going to be perfect, right? We will never be perfect in terms of accessibility, but pick one thing, make that one thing better every week or every sprint, or one thing a month that you want to look at in your work and make it more inclusive. Whether that's, you've included and talked with a person with a disability and talked with them about the kind of challenges that they're facing, or you have gone off and learned something new and incorporated that into your work through some other means. Pick one thing a month, pick one thing a sprint, whatever it is. Just always be looking to make things better, and don't obsess with perfect. And better is, I will take 80% better than any day over 0% perfect.
Yeah.
Right. So always make things better, and pick that one thing, get really good at that, and then add in another thing. I need to learn more about how to design forms better for people with low vision. Awesome. Go do that for a month, right? Or go do that for 2 weeks or whatever it is, and then move on to something else and just keep getting better.
That's great advice. Excellent. Well, Derek, thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, Derek Featherstone, and we'll have a lot more coming up today. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.